Please, this is not an order. If you like the content, don't forget to like and subscribe our channel for more comments and discussions. Murder stories that have not been clearly elucidated always attract people's curiosity. Everyone wants to know the truth behind the complicated murder cases that couldn't be solved despite the continuous efforts of law enforcement. In this video, we are going to talk about an unsolved murder case that took place in Ireland in the 1990s. Two countries cooperated to solve this case, but until then, the real truth behind this murder has not been discovered. This case concerns Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a French producer who was brutally killed in 1996 in the south of Ireland. Sophie had been found dead in her holiday home in West Cork in December 1996. Her murder attracted considerable media attention and generated much speculation and controversy for over 20 years. As Sophie was French but was killed in Ireland, her case involved both France and Ireland. Sophie's case was so popular that it was adapted into a documentary on Netflix called Sophie, A Murder in West Cork. Sophie Toscan du Plantier was not just killed, she was violently assaulted and beaten to death. The murder immediately made headlines not only in Ireland but also in France. An investigation involving several police officers, detectives, and investigators was quickly launched in order to find the murderer and his motive. This investigation became one of the most publicized in Irish criminal history. It turns out that Sophie went on holiday to Ireland often, especially since 1993, when she bought her holiday home in Dunmanus West, Turmore, Cork. The Republic of Ireland stated at the time of the investigation that Sophie often visited this house with her family during the years preceding her death. Sophie Toscan du Plantier had been found dead by her neighbor, Shirley Forster, on December 23, 1996, around 10 a.m. She had been so beaten and disfigured that she had a hard time recognizing her. According to the police, her face contained several serious injuries that made it almost impossible to identify her. During her autopsy, the medical examiner claimed that she had brain lacerations and swellings, a fractured skull, and multiple head injuries. It turns out that her face was smashed with cinder blocks. The fact that the Irish police did not find enough evidence to close the case greatly impacted Irish society. This murder case is considered a stain on society that can only be removed once it is clearly elucidated. At the time of her death, Sophie was 39 years old and the wife of the former president of Unifrance Films, Daniel Toscan du Plantier. The victim's body was found precisely about 50 meters from her home, which proves that she struggled with her attacker and tried to escape but without success. It is possible that she struggled for a long time but could not escape her attacker because he was armed and she was helpless. The Irish police, which is the Garda Síochána, led the investigation into the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. The investigation into this murder was difficult and therefore took a long time. As the crime scene was located in a remote location, police and investigators found it very difficult to obtain conclusive evidence. Thus, we can say that the investigation faced significant logistical challenges and was complicated due to several factors. The case also stalled because local residents were unwilling to cooperate with the investigation and provide information that could help identify the killer or find his location. The main suspect in this case is Ian Bailey, a British journalist living in Ireland. However, the investigation concerning this suspect could not succeed because of problems of jurisdiction. Ireland did not want to extradite the main suspect, while France requested it several times. The main argument of the Irish authorities for refusing extradition was that there was a considerable lack of evidence concerning him. Unfortunately, this difference in jurisdiction contributed to the complexity and length of the case. So, the main suspect was convicted in France but freed in Ireland. The investigation did not stop in 1996 but continued for several years. This case was taken seriously again about a year ago because, over the years, new elements have been found. Since its beginning, the investigation has been marked by twists and contradictory developments. Every time the Irish authorities seemed to find a lead, it led them to a dead end, that is to say, each time they came up against elements that prevented them from continuing their investigation by following this lead. Evidence was often presented by investigators, but most was either false or invalid. During the investigation, the authorities often encountered conflicting testimony and allegations of professional misconduct in the collection of evidence. It seemed as though something or someone was keeping the authorities from learning the full story of this cruel murder case at all costs. The fact that Sophie Toscan du Plantier was a public figure and not an ordinary person increased suspicions that her killer specifically targeted her out of revenge or some other reason and did not kill her by chance. Sometimes murderers target random people just to fulfill their murderous desires, but that doesn't seem to be the case with Sophie's murder. Because of this complicated case, which has not been resolved, tensions have emerged between the French and Irish authorities. Many people have therefore suggested that this case could have been politically influenced. The birth name of Sophie Toscan du Plantier was Sophie Baugnol. She was a woman passionate about the world of cinema, and she was greatly involved in the film industry. Before her death, she had worked on several film and documentary productions in France and collaborated with several directors and recognized actors. She was a respected and influential figure in the film industry who was known for her commitment to the arts and culture. Her family and friends described her as an energetic, intelligent, and loving woman. No one could have thought that she was going to die in such a brutal and tragic way. Fortunately, her memory is honored by people who knew her and by all who continue to fight to solve the mystery of her death. Although most people seem to be giving up on this case, investigators and relatives of Sophie Toscan du Plantier are still focused on it and will not give up until they find the culprit and bring him to justice to pay for his crime. As this case was highly publicized, debates and speculations about the identity and motives of the killer generated great public interest. The Sophie Toscan du Plantier case is a good example that shows the challenges faced by the families of the victims in their quest for truth and justice. Unfortunately, many families only want justice for their loved one who was wrongfully killed, but due to several factors, they find themselves unable to find the individual who destroyed their lives by killing their loved one and make him pay for his crimes. Several specialists in cold case investigation have been involved in solving this case, but they are still having difficulty identifying the culprit. The Sophie Toscan du Plantier case is still a cold case in Ireland, but this is not the case in France. The French authorities judged the case as almost closed because they condemned the main suspect, Ian Bailey. Since the start of the investigation, this former local freelance journalist has been suspected by the authorities of being responsible for Sophie's murder. He is one of the main suspects in this case because he is one of the first people to arrive at the crime scene, and he seems to know details of the investigation that the police have not disclosed publicly and that only the murderer might know. Specifically, he wrote several articles about this case in which he provided details of the investigation, which were confidential and known only to the police and the killer. Several clues against him have been found, but not physical evidence. Moreover, this British journalist lived near the victim's home and had been in contact with her on several occasions. According to witnesses, he was seen prowling the area shortly before the murder. It turns out that Ian Bailey was questioned several times by the Irish police and was even arrested twice, in 1997 and 1998. However, no conclusive evidence could be established against him, and he always denied any involvement in the murder. Due to several clues that pointed to his possible involvement in Sophie's murder, Ian Bailey was brought to justice in 2003 and charged with murder in Ireland. However, as the evidence against him was insufficient, the prosecutor dropped the charges in 2005. The reason for the charges being dropped was that the trial was marred by conflicting testimony and questions about the reliability of some key testimony. It is important to note that the fact that Mr. Bailey was released does not mean that he was declared innocent, but rather that the prosecution could not prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. During the first investigation following the discovery of Sophie's body, the investigators questioned all the neighbors of the victim as well as all the people she knew. Ian Bailey was known in the local community as a freelance journalist and writer and lived not far from the victim's home. This journalist provided statements and information to the investigators, but he also aroused suspicion due to his behavior and certain contradictions in his accounts. In other words, his statements did not seem credible because they contradicted what he had said during previous interrogations or what people interviewed had said about him. The fact that he did not tell the truth during interrogations and gave false information to the police is very suspicious, so the authorities could not rule out the possibility that he could be the much-wanted murderer. Investigators focused on this reporter because several witnesses saw him interact with Toscan du Plantier at local social gatherings. Despite the statements of several witnesses, Ian Bailey has always denied the murder and maintained that he did not know the victim personally. Moreover, according to investigators, he told some of his friends that he had knowledge of the murder and was inexplicably connected to the case. However, during questioning, Bailey maintained that had been misunderstood by his friends and that his statements had been twisted. In a murder investigation, investigators are always looking for the last people who had contact with the victim, the people who resent her for specific reasons, the people she interacts with on a regular basis, etc. Generally, by questioning these people and the relatives of the victim, detectives and investigators find clues that allow them to move forward in their investigation and sometimes even identify the culprit. For this case, the Irish authorities interviewed everyone who interacted with Sophie Toscan du Plantier from her arrival at the airport 3 days before her murder until the last time she was seen. Among the circumstantial evidence that raised suspicions against Bailey were shoe prints found at the crime scene. These prints appeared to belong to the journalist and were therefore compared to him. However, this evidence was not accepted as it was inconclusive. We will now talk about who Ian Bailey was before he was suspected of the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. Ian Bailey was born in 1956 in Manchester, England, and moved to Ireland in the 1990s, around the same time that Sophie bought her holiday home in West Cork. Prior to his involvement in the murder case, Bailey worked as a freelance journalist and writer. It turns out that he has contributed to local and national publications on different topics. His articles covered a variety of topics, such as politics, the environment, and news items. For a long time, he was also interested in literature and wrote poems and novels. Thus, it is clear that he had a passion for writing and lived by doing a job that he particularly loved. Bailey only became known to the general public after he was questioned by Irish police in connection with the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier in 1996. That is, he was not publicly known as a journalist or writer but as the main suspect in a cruel murder. Because of his popularity as a prime suspect, his interrogations and his alleged involvement in this case generated great media interest not only in Ireland but also in France. Despite all the clues pointing to him, Bailey has maintained that he was innocent and the victim of a botched investigation and sensationalist media coverage. His involvement in this murder case did not affect his job or his style of writing, as he continued to write articles. Even after undergoing several interrogations and being repeatedly suspected by the Irish and French authorities, he continued to write articles, give interviews about his experience, and claim his innocence. It turns out that he also published a book called The West Cork Way in 2015, in which he discusses the case of the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier and shares his thoughts on the justice system. Although the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case dates back to 1996, it has never been closed or abandoned. Over the years, investigators have looked back on this case to find new clues and perhaps finally resolve this cold case. In June 2022, almost 26 years later, the Irish police announced that they would re-examine the case in order to find new lines of investigation. The individuals responsible for the investigation have joined forces with the police and investigators who have been on this case since its inception in order to collect all the information on this murder that would be useful to them and will allow them to find new leads. The area's superintendent of police said the case must be resolved so that the victim's relatives know clearly what happened to her and bring her killer to justice. He also said that anyone living in the Tormore area of County Cork between December 20th and December 23rd of the year in which the murder took place, i.e., 1996, should contact the investigators and provide them with the information they remember about this case. It is possible that, thanks to the information they have given, the investigators will find new leads that may allow them to find the murderer. The superintendent has made it clear that those who will be interviewed will provide everything they know about Sophie Toscan du Plantier and what she did or where she was in the days leading up to her murder. Investigators believe there may be people with key information about this case who did not show up at the first investigation for specific reasons, so they called them to testify even though the case dates back over 25 years. On the side of France, the judges in charge of this case claimed to have gathered enough evidence to bring Ian Bailey to justice. So, in 2019, a trial against him was held, but he was not present as an accused. In other words, it was a trial in absentia. The reason for this was that the Irish authorities have always refused to extradite Ian Bailey, despite the arrest warrants issued by France. Despite the Irish authorities' refusal to cooperate, Ian Bailey was sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, as long as he lives in Ireland, he will be free, and his sentence will not be carried out. If he leaves his country, he will be immediately condemned by France. During the trial, the family of the victim as well as the witnesses in this case were present and were relieved of the condemnation of Mr. Bailey, even if he remains free as long as he is in Ireland. The family of Sophie Toscan du Plantier is firmly convinced that the culprit in the murder of the French producer is Ian Bailey and will never give up the search for evidence that will prove that is indeed the culprit. The Irish authorities do not agree with France's actions in this case because they believe that the French authorities are too hard on Bailey when there is no formal proof that he is the murderer. According to his lawyer, Ian Bailey has not been a suspect for more than 14 years, but in France, he is not only a suspect because everyone firmly believes that he is Sophie's murderer. However, as the Irish authorities have announced the re-examination of the case, it proves that they are no longer as convinced as before that Ian Bailey is not the culprit. The victim's family was relieved to hear this news and said they hope the new ongoing investigation will lead to a new trial for Bailey in which he will be present. The main suspect said he was happy that there is a new investigation into this case because it will probably prove his innocence and uncover the real murderer of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. According to Toby's lawyer, Ian Bailey always hoped that the real culprit would be brought to justice because Hugh was constantly in distress over the charges against him. Since the start of the investigation, more than 26 years ago, he has always been identified as the culprit, and people's opinions of him have always been negative. To restore his reputation, the only way is for the police to find the real culprit and the evidence that will prove his innocence. Thus, both on the side of the accused and the family of the victim, the resumption of the investigations gives rise to new hope, but unfortunately not great conviction. The investigation into this case has been re-examined several times in recent years, but this has not led to the resolution of this difficult case. To sum up, the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case is a complex and controversial case that has captured the attention of the public both in France and in Ireland. Despite the years that have passed, the mystery of her death is still present. This case clearly highlights the challenges that investigators face when trying to solve serious and sensitive crimes. Also, by clearly examining the investigations carried out to resolve this cold case, we understand the importance of international cooperation in cross-border investigations. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more reviews and discussions. Thank you for watching.